Hello everyone and welcome back to lecture. Today we're going to be taking time to focus on hallucinogens and how they affect us pharmacologically. During this lecture there will be a specific focus on the cultural aspects that surround these drugs. Let's go ahead and get started. Everything that we've discussed so far has either been in the stimulant or depressant group, and we've seen more of an effect on the entire body. With previous groups we've seen either increases or decreases in heart rate, increases and decreases in blood pressure, and the same with breathing rates. Hallucinogenic drugs are different in that they primarily affect the brain and the way that we sense things. So taking a hallucinogen causes an alteration in the way the brain sees things. We see colors differently, noises sound differently, sights are often distorted, or we see things that might not really be there. Thoughts are processed differently as well. You may experience anxiety or paranoia regarding your surroundings. Depersonalization may also occur. Depersonalization is a state in which one's thoughts and feelings seem unreal, or they do not belong to oneself, or in which somebody loses all sense of identity, meaning you might not see yourself as a person anymore, but rather as an object. Hallucinogens are often associated with cultural and social movements. Native Americans use peyote in a lot of their religious ceremonies, and it's legal for them to be able to do so. You do, however, have to be a registered member of a Native American church and also be a registered member of a tribe. For the most part, the use of peyote takes place on reservation lands, but it can be taken off the reservation if it is done by someone who is a minister or a church official. Timothy Leary, the man who is in the photo on your screen, on the other hand, he has had a much different experience with hallucinogens. He has had a variety of different life experiences that all seem to contradict one another. Timothy Leary was in the Army during World War II. He received a PhD in clinical psychology from UC Berkeley in 1950, and he even stayed on for a while as an assistant professor at Berkeley before he moved on to Harvard. He began working on hallucinogens when he started working on psilocybin rather than LSD. He actually linked up with Allen Ginsberg, who is a famous beat poet, and the two started to campaign for the experimentation of LSD. He actually did some experimentation on his own with prisoners and found that the use of LSD reduced recidivism around 20%. Then he started doing his campus tours. He would go to music festivals and things, but he was more famous for college campus tours. He would go around and expound on the virtues of LSD and how it provided enlightenment and how it would open up this brand new world to people. He actually wrote a book called The Psychedelic Experience, and it is still for sale, and there is a free PDF version floating around if you ever want to read it. The drug is basically an instruction manual for what you should do while you're high on a psychedelic drug. This right here is a picture of Millbrook Estate. In 1963, Timothy Leary and a couple colleagues launched what was the first of what was intended to be a big string of psychedelic drug research centers at the mansion, in which they referred to as the Big House. Leary wrote his version of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, called The Psychedelic Experience, in this house that's on your screen, and even came up with the tune in, turn on, and drop out slogan while he was taking a shower here. Sometimes it's referred to as ground zero for the psychedelic movement in America, and the house hosted some of the most controversial and visionary personalities of the 1960s. The farm was actually owned by a family named Hitchcock, who were relatives of the Mellon family. The Mellon family is most commonly known for the Carnegie Mellon University in Pennsylvania and Mellon Banks. The youngest daughter of the Hitchcock family, was having an affair with Timothy Leary, which is why he was able to get up there in the first place. In the early 1960s, LSD was still legal, and visitors to the estate could take the drug in any way they wanted, provided that they rewrote a report for Leary afterwards. By most account, people under the influence spent a great deal of time chanting, listening to records, and skinny dipping in a nearby pond. The psychedelic movement was evolving concurrently with the women's movement, the civil rights movement, the sexual revolution, and the anti-war movement in the midst of a rock and roll revolution. And all of these elements were part of the cosmic drama that was allowed to play itself out on the stages of Millbrook in an atmosphere of genteel anarchy that rendered all things possible. There are a few types of hallucinogenic drugs out there, but we'll spend most of our time talking about the traditional ones. These are our LSD type drugs. There's also phenylethylamine, and these drugs have both a stimulant and psychedelic effect, such as ecstasy or amphetamines. There's also anticholinergic. Sorry, some of these get a little bit hard to say. These are naturally occurring plants that have psychedelic effect. Sometimes cocaine can cause hallucinations and bad trips, depending on what the cocaine is laced with. And then, of course, steroids. When you take a hallucinogenic drug, one of three things can happen. There are three main effects of hallucinogenic drugs. First is psychedelic effects. These are the ones that cause hallucinations, sound distortions, seeing things that aren't there, etc. The second main effect is a psychotogenic one. This reaction causes psychotic behavior. It is a serious mental disorder characterized by thinking and emotions that are so impaired that they indicate that the person experiencing them has lost all contact with reality. People who are psychotic have false thoughts or delusions and may also see or hear things that are not there, meaning hallucinations. They can also be angry, paranoid, delusional, or experience manic depressive reactions. Finally, there's psychotomimetic reactions, and this is when an individual's inability to recognize and respond appropriately to reality is severely diminished. These drugs can also cause altered senses. So the idea of synesthesia, which is a subjective sensation or an image of a sense that other than the one that is being stimulated, such as an auditory sensation caused by a visual stimulus. This basically means that things might change color, they might take on another shape, they may grow or shrink in size, and a lot of people who are on a hallucinogenic drug report seeing a thick, bold black outline on things that didn't previously have that outline. There also might be a loss of control, which is represented by flashbacks, meaning recurrences of earlier drug-induced sensory experiences in the absence of the drug. So these can take place months or years after the trip has actually occurred. They can come out of nowhere and be terrifying for the individual who's going through the flashback. And basically what this means is that even though if I don't have any LSD left in my system, or I'm not actively on LSD rather, the flashbacks can just occur months and years down the line because I have taken LSD in the past. There is also an element of self-reflection, meaning we're making the conscious the unconscious. Sigmund Freud said this in the 1950s as an advocate for using LSD in clinical psychology cases. It allows us to open up the mind and allows us to experience or accept memories and feelings that you may have repressed over a long period of time. That might be all right if you're trying to get someone to recover from the death of a loved one, for example, or something like that. But what happens when the individual does not find the acceptance that you're striving for? You can also experience a loss of identity, or what some call a cosmic merging, meaning this mystical, spiritual aspect of the drug experience. This was largely what Leary was after. You're no longer an individual with cares and responsibility tied to a government or a job or a family. You're one with the universe the same way that a tree is, or that a bird is, or a cloud is. There's no beginning, there's no end, everything is linked together. This one is often discussed as being the item that people aren't able to comprehend until they actually drop acid. For the rest of the lecture, we're going to focus on the big three: LSD, mescaline, which is found in peyote, and psilocybin, which is found in magic mushrooms. We'll begin with LSD. The physical structure of LSD results in a powder that is colorless, odorless, and tasteless. Very recently, there has been an increase in the sale of colored powder. This one on your screen is purple, but LSD can also come in blues and greens and oranges, and normally these colors are very vibrant. So what are the different colors for? Basically, they're the calling card of the dealer or the supplier who makes them. LSD can come in powder or liquid form. The powder is often converted into a liquid very easily. Once it's made into a liquid, then it's commonly known as acid. Street names for this drug include acid, blotter acid, microdots, and window panes. This is the most common way to take LSD. This is a blotter paper, and it will dissolve on your tongue. You just have to add a small amount of LSD onto the paper in liquid form, and it will dissolve on its own. In the 1960s, it was recommended that for first-time users, you don't go any higher than 90 to 110 micrograms. Very experienced users can go up into the 600 and 700 microgram range, but if you want to limit the chances of having a very bad trip or a really bad freak out, most people stay around the 200 to 400 microgram range. Some say that 250 micrograms is where the exact best trip comes into play. But with today's LSD, you don't want to go any higher than 20 to 30 micrograms. That's crazy in comparison to the older forms of LSD. This drug is much more potent today. These are sheets of blotter papers. Each square is considered one hit and can cost as little as $10. You're really only getting a very small bit on each square. 1 full gram of LSD would be enough to provide a dose for 10,000 people. 1 gallon of liquid LSD would be enough to intoxicate over 3.5 million people. Think about what that would do to a city if someone were to put that in the water supply. This is LSD put on sugar cubes. You just basically pop the sugar cube in your mouth and you let it dissolve. These are the small gelatin squares known as window panes. They also dissolve in your mouth. In terms of the physiological effects of the drug, you may experience a massive increase in neural activity in some of your brain regions. This is commonly known as an electrical storm. Basically what's happening is there's a massive increase in your neural activity. Your brain is just in hyperdrive based on the amount of things that it's experiencing. The drug will also activate your sympathetic nerve system. This causes a rise in blood pressure, heart rate, and body temperature. So what does that sound like? It almost sounds like a stimulant type of effect. But does this make any sense? If your brain is all over the place, then the rest of you would be as well, causing a stimulant type of effect. Think about how your body reacts when you're startled or when somebody jumps out at you. You might get that little burst of adrenaline, you get warm, your heart beats a little faster. That's basically what's happening the entire time you're on an LSD trip. Your parasympathetic nervous system creates an increase in saliva production and nausea, and individuals who take LSD don't actually become physically dependent, but the psychological dependency can occur. So when you take LSD, it takes about 30 to 90 minutes for the effect of the drug to really be felt. Because you're seeing things in a different way, it makes sense for your brain to become more creative and more involved in producing art or discussion from a different point of view. So I'm about to show you 9 drawings that were made half a century ago by an artist who was under the influence of LSD or acid during an experiment designed to investigate the drug's psychedelic effects. The unnamed artist was given 2 50 microgram doses of LSD, one 65 minutes after the other, and had access to an activity box full of crayons and pencils. He was the subject of his art. The patient who took the LSD was the subject of his own art, and he was told to basically draw a self-portrait at different intervals. So in this process of drawing himself, the artist also reported how he felt based on how the acid was affecting him at each point in time he drew another sketch. So let's go ahead and take a look at what was happening inside the artist's head at these different intervals. So the first picture on your screen was drawn 20 minutes in after he took the first LSD dose. The patient chose to draw using charcoal, and he commented that he felt completely normal. I didn't feel any effects of the drug quite yet. This one is 85 minutes into the first dose. 20 minutes after the second dose was administered. The patient seemed overly euphoric. The artist commented, I quote, "I can see you clearly, so clearly. This, you, it's all, I'm having a little trouble controlling this pencil. It just seems to want to keep going." In other words, the artist technique doesn't necessarily keep pace with the flow ideas during the acid trip, but with practice, it can help. Researchers stated that most artists become adept at working under the influence of LSD after a period of time. This picture was drawn 2 hours and 30 minutes after the first dose, 85 minutes after the second dose. The patient appeared to be very focused on the business of drawing, according to the researchers. The artist commented, quote, "My outlines seem normal, but very vivid. Everything is changing color. My hand must follow the bold sweeps of the line. I feel as if my consciousness is situated in the part of my body that's now active. My hand, my elbow, my tongue," end quote. 2 hours and 32 minutes after the first dose. So basically this is just 2 minutes after the previous picture. The patient seems gripped by the pad of his paper, and he states, quote, "I'm trying another drawing. The outlines of the model are normal, but now those of my drawing are not. The outline of my hand is going weird too. It's not a very good drawing, is it? I give up. I'll try again." 2 hours and 35 minutes, so just 3 minutes after the previous picture. Researchers note that the patient follows quickly with another drawing. Upon completing it, he starts laughing, then becomes startled by something on the floor. The artist comments, quote, I'll do a drawing in one flourish, without stopping, one line, no break," end quote. This picture was drawn 2 hours and 45 minutes after the first dose. You can tell that it has become extremely abstract in nature and does not even really resemble a person anymore. The researchers state that the patient tries to climb into the activity box and is generally agitated and responds slowly to the suggestion that he might like to draw some more. He has become largely nonverbal. The patient has begun to mumble inaudibly to a tune, and it sounds like the song "Thanks for the Memory." He has changed mediums in his drawing. The artist comments, quote, everything is. It's changed. They're calling. Your face, it's interwoven. Who is? End quote. So you can really see here that the LSD is kicking in. This one occurs 4 hours and 25 minutes after the first dose, and the artist comments that this will be my best drawing, like the first one, only better. If I'm not careful, I'll lose control of my movements, but I won't, because I know. He then repeats, I know, several more times. This drawing occurs 5 hours and 45 minutes after the first dose, and researchers report that the patient continued to move around the room, intersecting the space into complex variations. It's an hour and a half before he settles down to draw again, and he appears to be over the effects of the drugs. The artist comments, quote, I can feel my knees again. I think it's starting to wear off. This is a pretty good drawing. This pencil is mighty hard to hold, end quote. And researchers comment that he's holding a crayon. Okay, so 8 hours after the first dose, the researchers state that the patient is sitting on a bunk bed. He reports that the intoxication has worn off, except for the occasional distorting of our faces. We ask him for a final drawing, which he performs with little enthusiasm. The artist comments, quote, I have nothing to say about this last drawing. It's bad and uninteresting. I want to go home now. So this series of photographs, or these pictures that the artist drew, shows the drug at work probably better than anything else I could show you. While we don't necessarily see the world through the artist's eyes exactly as he sees it, this is coming as close as possible. Look at the distortion, the dysmorphia, and how abstract the photos become after a certain point. Our brains are absolutely so crazy and wonderful at the exact same time. So that's LSD. Now let's talk about mescaline. You need about 300 to 600 milligrams of mescaline to experience any effect. Mescaline is the active ingredient in peyote. Peyote is a small type of cactus that grows in small little ball shapes called buttons. It will take about 20 peyote buttons to get 600 milligrams of mescaline. You can dry them out, slice them up, chew them, eat them. They can also be boiled and you can make tea from them. Peyote will begin to take effect within 30 to 120 minutes, and the hallucinations can last more than 2 hours. So this stuff is a lot less potent than LSD, but can produce a cross tolerance with LSD. Mescaline affects the serotonin levels in your body. This map shows some of the more common growing areas for naturally growing peyote. You can see here that a lot of it grows in Mexico and the southwest fringes of Texas. This is a different view of the peyote buttons. This picture is showing things in terms of growth from a newly formed button to a completely developed portion of the cactus. This is a large growing cactus. Look at how many buttons are on there. Remember that you need roughly 20 buttons to get enough peyote to see an effect. This picture shows how large the buttons actually are. They're much smaller than you would think they are. You can really see the size comparison once they're being held in someone's hands. These buttons are in the process of being dried out. Once they're fully dried, they can then be ground into powder. This is the dried powder. It's rather an olive green color. This powder can then be made into tea. And this is the tea ready to be consumed. Once you drink the tea, if that is your choice of consumption, then what will happen to you in terms of the effects? As you can see, peyote creates a variety of effects very similar to those created by the consumption of LSD. You will experience dilation of the pupils, increase in body temperature, possible anxiety, visual hallucinations, alteration of your body image, vomiting, and potential muscular relaxation. Next up we have psilocybin, or the active ingredient in magic mushrooms. That is the main ingredient used by Albert Hofmann in his experimentations with LSD and the creation of the drug in the 1930s. Hofmann basically ate 32 mushrooms and then recorded the effects and his reactions to them. Since these are mushrooms, how do you think they're going to be administered? Yep, you're right, you just eat them. They can either be dried or eaten fresh. They do grow wild, and a few years ago there was a report that there were mushrooms growing in the gardens of Buckingham Palace. They were indeed of the magic variety. These are magic mushrooms. Do they look familiar to you? They are depicted in a variety of different places, culturally and socially. Most commonly, we see them in the Alice in Wonderland movies. The whole movie basically represented a trip of sorts, and the magic mushrooms were everywhere. Psilocybin is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms. There are certain concerns associated with cross-tolerance between psilocybin, LSD, and mescaline. Remember what cross-tolerance means. When you take one drug for a while, you build up tolerance to that drug. When you take a similarly structured drug, you already have a tolerance to that drug based on your prior use of the other drug. The body's responses to psilocybin are similar to those found in the other drugs we discussed, so I'm going to somewhat skip this section as we've discussed it twice already. This is a map of the areas where magic mushrooms grow. As you can see here, there is a lot of growth in warmer climates. South and Central America has a lot of growth. Some grow in Africa, in the Middle East, and on the European continent. But Australia has us all beat. The entire continent and country has the potential for growth. We can also grow these mushrooms in the U.S. They grow best when there is a lot of moisture in the air, so more humid climates work best. And they grow in areas where there is a lot of food for them to eat. Natural fertilizer works best, so where might you find some naturally growing mushrooms? Cow fields are a wonderful place to look. Our last drug of the day is Phencyclidine, or PCP. We also call this one angel dust. Manufactured originally as an anesthetic drug, they were successful in the effects of the drug, but noticed that when patients woke up, they were starting to exhibit schizophrenia-like symptoms, so they chose to discontinue it for that purpose. Then they used it as a veterinary anesthesia because it wasn't having the same effects on animals. This drug is a Schedule II drug, but it currently isn't manufactured legally. All of the PCP that is currently produced in the U.S. is done so illegally. It's often cooked in makeshift labs. It can be cooked pretty quickly, and then they disassemble the lab. It comes in liquid format, so then they dry it out into powdered form. Here's a picture of PCP in powder form. As we know, once something is in powder, then the possibilities are endless. So how is PCP administered? It can be administered orally, smoked, sniffed, or injected. The high lasts about 4 to 6 hours, and there is normally a come down period of about 6 to 24 hours. So the effects are lasting for quite a bit of time. How does PCP affect you? Some of the regular hallucinogenic effects are still there, but this one can result in an overdose of sorts. Sometimes people who use PCP will stare into space for a while. They don't really blink, they just sit there and stare. But their eyes are not effective, so their pupils will remain the same, but the stare will be present. Finally, PCP is different from other drugs because of the feeling of strength that it gives you. PCP doesn't actually give you super strength, but it does make you feel as though you have it. It also makes you think that you can fight someone bigger, taller, stronger than you, and then all of a sudden, you're laid out. So there's a false sense of power and invulnerability occurring when PCP is used. Most people take PCP in groups rather than as a solitary event. So if you're taking the drug and you're hallucinating around all of these people, it would make sense that you might be violent and get into an altercation with someone who you're taking the drug with. Remember earlier that I stated that PCP was originally created as an anesthetic drug, but the patients were waking up exhibiting symptoms that were schizophrenic in nature. That still happens when you're taking the drug recreationally. Today we changed gears a little bit and we discussed a drug category that is different from the typical stimulant and depressant drugs that we've been talking about all semester. While these drugs do end up causing some physical symptoms that are similar to those of both depressant and stimulant drugs, these drugs are unique due to the psychological symptoms that they cause. Unlike most drugs, those ones are culturally and socially relevant to specific groups. In the next lecture, we're going to focus on marijuana. This is normally the topic that students want to discuss the most and have saved the best for almost last. Meet me back here next time when we begin discussing marijuana and the topic of legalization in the United States. Thanks for your time, and I'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone. Bye.